There you go. Hi Fodders, good to see you here. Thank you for reminding me to turn my microphone on. I've just been downstairs letting the cat inside. Goodness, just came back. I'm a couple of minutes late. And then I had to rush up the stairs because that's where my office is. But we shall start with the story in just a moment when I get it open. So for those of you who haven't been here before, I know there are a few of you who have, we are reading through some very old-fashioned children's books. Some of them I think probably wouldn't even make it to being called children's books today. They would just be a general fantasy book because sometimes they used to write about themes that we don't now talk about with children. And sometimes it's because their attitudes can be a little bit off in our modern day and age where we actually understand more about people who are different to us. These ones that I'm usually reading, they're just a little bit different styled to what modern ones are. New setting, actually this is my normal setting. Last time you saw me for this, I was in a different room because we had visitors downstairs from where I'm sitting at the moment. It's an open plan office space and I wanted to give them privacy to talk together with my husband, so I was down the other end of the house. So now I'm at my proper computer using the proper computer and webcam instead of using my phone, so hopefully the picture will be a bit better quality. So we are reading The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and it's considered to be a Victorian fantasy, not a fairy story because there are no fairies in it, as the author was said to say to somebody. And I'm reading off a very, very old iPad mini. It's actually a first generation iPad mini. It's great for reading books on, even though you can't really do anything else on it. You can't even put most apps on it anymore. So if you ever want to read any of these stories that we read yourself or any other similar to them, go to Project Gutenberg, which is a website for public domain books, and then look for children's books. There'll be a subsection for children's books. So that's Gutenberg, Gutenberg.org, and you can download them or you can read them online or whatever. I download them to the iPad mini and read them to you, and hopefully soon I will actually have got through the stages of sorting my office space, which is also storage space for the rest of the house, and found my old boxes, and I'll be able to read from actual books to you, and then I can actually just turn it around and show you the pictures in it and not having them all shiny and reflective from my lights. So here we go. The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, chapter 16. The Ring. Let's see if any of us remember what the ring was and what it was for. The same moment her nurse came into the room sobbing. When she saw her sitting there, she started back with a loud cry of amazement and joy. Then running to her, she caught her up in her arms and covered her dear little face with kisses. "My precious darling princess, where have you been? What has happened to you? We've all been crying our eyes out and searching the house from top to bottom for you." Not quite from the top, thought Irene to herself, and she might have added, not quite to the bottom, perhaps, if she had known all. But the one she would not, and the other she could not say. "Oh, Lootie, I've had such a dreadful adventure," she replied, and told her all about the cat with the long legs, and how she ran out upon the mountain and came back again. But she said nothing of her grandmother or her lamp. "And there we've been searching for you all over the house for more than an hour and a half," exclaimed the nurse. "But that's no matter now. We've got you. Only, Princess, I must say," she added, her mood changing, "what you ought to have done was to call for your own Lootie to come and help you, instead of running out of the house and up the mountain in that wild, I must say, foolish fashion." "Well, Lootie," said Irene quietly, "perhaps if you had a big cat, all legs, running at you, you mightn't exactly know which was the wisest thing to do at the moment." "I wouldn't run up the mountain anyhow," returned Lootie. "Not if you had time to think about it. But then when those creatures came at you that night on the mountain, you were so frightened yourself that you lost your way home." This put a stop to Lootie's reproaches. She had been on the point of saying that the long-legged cat must have been a twilight fantasy of the princess's, but the memory of the horrors of that night and of the talking to which the king had given her in consequence prevented her from saying that which, after all, she did not half believe, having a strong suspicion that the cat was a goblin, for the fact was that she knew nothing of the difference between the goblins and their creatures. She counted them all just goblins. Without another word, she went and got some fresh tea and bread and butter for the princess. Before she returned, the whole household, headed by the housekeeper, burst into the nursery to exult over their darling. They've only got jobs because the princess is living in this house, okay? Just in case you didn't realise. They're also rather fond of her too. The gentlemen-at-arms followed and were ready enough to believe all she told them about the long-legged cat. Indeed, though wise enough to say nothing about it, they remembered with no little horror just such a creature amongst those they had surprised at their gambols upon the princess's lawn. In their own hearts they blamed themselves for not having kept better watch. And their captain gave order that from this night the front door and all the windows on the ground floor should be locked immediately the sun set, and opened after upon no pretence whatsoever. In other words, don't open them after dark. The men-at-arms redoubled their vigilance, and for some time there was no further cause for alarm. When the princess woke the next morning, her nurse was bending over her. "How your ring does glow this morning, princess, just like a fiery rose," she said. "Does it, Lootie?" returned Irene. "Who gave me the ring, Lootie? I know I've had it a long time, but where did I get it? I don't remember." "I think it must have been your mother gave it to you, princess, but really for as long as you have worn it, I don't remember that I ever heard," answered the nurse. "I will ask my king papa the next time he comes," said Irene. I don't know if you remember, that's the end of the chapter by the way, I don't know if you remember, but her grandmother said to ask Lootie where she had got it from. So there you go. She was right. It meant that there was nothing she needed to worry about to do with receiving the ring from her grandmother. Okay, I better have a quick mouthful of water. That's what we do at chapter breaks. Have a drink of water. And don't forget, you need to have your drink of water too. It's very good for your brain, as well as for your voice, and how your body works. So, here we go. And we are going to carry on with chapter 17. XVII 17. Chapter 17 of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. And it is called Springtime, because they've just had such a long, wet, grey, windy, cold winter. Kind of like what we're coming into now in New Zealand. That's what our weather seems to be doing. Unlike the heat waves that they're having over in Europe and in North Americas. So, springtime, the spring so dear to all creatures, young and old, came at last, and before the first few days of it had gone, the king rode through its budding valleys to see his little daughter. He had been in a distant part of his dominions all the winter, for he was not in the habit of stopping in one great city, or of visiting only his favourite country houses, but he moved from place to place, that all his people might know him. Wherever he journeyed, he kept a constant lookout for the ablest and best men to put into office, and wherever he found himself mistaken, and those he had appointed incapable or unjust, he removed them at once. Hence you see it was his care of the people that kept him from seeing his princess so often as he would have liked. You may wonder why he did not take her with him, but there are several reasons against his doing so, and I suspect her great-great-grandmother had had a principal hand in preventing it. Once more Irene heard the bugle blast, and once more she was at the gate to meet her father as he rode up on his great white horse. After they had been alone for a little while, she thought of what she had resolved to ask him. I'm just going to adjust the maximum on my microphone slightly so I don't deafen you all. "Please, King Papa," she said, "will you tell me where I got this pretty ring? I can't remember." The king looked at it. A strange, beautiful smile spread like sunshine over his face, and an answering smile, but at the same time a questioning one, spread like moonlight over Irene's. "It was your Queen Mamma's once," he said. "And why isn't it hers now?" asked Irene. "She does not want it now," said the king, looking grave. "Why doesn't she want it now?" "Because she's gone where all those rings are made." "And when shall I see her?" asked the princess. "Not for some time yet," answered the king, and the tears came into his eyes. Irene's only 7, so she doesn't necessarily understand the ways things happen in the world. Yes, bedtime stories are great. I have several friends who like listening to this as bedtime stories. Irene did not remember her mother and did not know why her father looked so and why the tears came into his eyes, but she put her arms around his neck and kissed him and asked no more questions. The king was much disturbed on hearing the report of the gentlemen-at-arms concerning the creatures they had seen, and I presume would have taken Irene with him that very day but for what the presence of the ring on her finger assured him of. About an hour before he left, Irene saw him go up the old stair, and he did not come down again till they were just ready to start, and she thought with herself that he had been up to see the old lady. When he went away, he left the other 6 gentlemen behind him, that there might be 6 of them, always on guard. So now they've actually got more men to keep watch. And now, in the lovely spring weather, Irene was out on the mountain the greater part of the day. In the warmer hollows there were lovely primroses, and not so many that she ever got tired of them. As often as she saw a new one opening, an eye of light in the blind earth, she would clap her hands with gladness, and unlike some children I know, instead of pulling it, that means picking it, would touch it as tenderly as if it had been a new baby, and having made its acquaintance, would leave it as happy as she had found it. She treated the plants on which they grew like birds' nests. Every fresh flower was like a new little bird to her. She would pay a visit to all the flower nests she knew, remembering each itself. She would go down on her knees and hands and knees beside one and say, "Good morning. Are you all smelling very sweet this morning? Goodbye." And then she would go to another nest and say the same. It was a favourite amusement with her. There were many flowers up and down, and she loved them all, but the primroses were her favourites. "They're not too shy, and they're not a bit forward," she would say to Lootie. There were goats about, too, over the mountain, and when the little kids came, she was as pleased with them as with the flowers. The goats belonged to the miners mostly, a few of them to Curdie's mother, but there were a good many wild ones that seemed to belong to nobody. These the goblins counted as theirs, and it was upon them partly that they lived. They set snares and dug pits for them, and did not scruple to take what tame ones happened to be caught, but they did not try to steal them in any other manner, because they were afraid of the dogs the hill people kept to watch them, for the knowing dogs always tried to bite their feet. But the goblins had a kind of sheep of their own, very queer creatures, which they drove out to feed at night. And the other goblin creatures were wise enough to keep good watch over them, for they knew they should have their bones by and by as meat, from them for meat. And that's the end of chapter 17. So that means it's time for another drink of water. Come on, your turn. I'm just going to type something in chat for those who haven't been here before. Oops, that didn't work. I need to actually have this focused. There you go. Is that going to work? Yes, it is. So what I've just done is I've put into the chat there because I haven't got in the habit of having it automated yet. I've put in the chat there the link for our Discord server and also my YouTube channel. If you join us over on Discord, which is another free thing for those of you who aren't used to it, you subscribe, you join, and then use that link to go to our Discord server. Sometimes I will post the illustrations from the story that we've been reading. I forgot to post the illustrations from the last chapters that we read the other day, but I will be putting those up. And also, if you have any pictures in your head or ideas or anything like that from the stories we've been reading and want to draw them, you're welcome to post them over on the Discord server. There's one of the channels there which is specifically for sharing pictures from the books, own illustrations, but also any that we do. And for those of you who want to catch the beginning of the story, it won't be available yet, but eventually, probably in about a couple of weeks' time, over on YouTube, which is that other link that I put up there for you, there will be a playlist which has this book in its entirety eventually, as they all cross-post. And also, if you don't actually join Discord but still want to make comments somewhere and aren't actually making them over here, you can make them over on YouTube. And also you can listen to any of my previous stories over there. So some people like doing that. So here we go. We are going to get on to the next chapter, which is chapter 18 of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. And it's called Curdie's Clue. Curdie's the little miner boy. He's a little bit older than the girl that we've got in our story, whose name is... What's her name? Does anyone remember? We'll carry on with the story. Curdie's Clue. Curdie was as watchful as ever, but was almost getting tired of his ill success. Every other night or so he followed the goblins about as they went on digging and boring and getting as near to them as he could. He watched them from behind stones and rocks, but as yet he seemed no nearer to finding out what they had in view. That's the plan that they had. As at first, he always kept hold of the end of a string, while his pickaxe, left just outside the hole by which he entered the goblins' country from the mine, continued to serve as an anchor and hold fast to the other end. The goblins, hearing no more noise in that quarter, had ceased to apprehend an immediate invasion, and kept no watch. One night, after dodging about and listening till he was nearly falling asleep with weariness, he began to roll up his ball, for he had resolved to go home to bed. It was not long, however, before he began to feel bewildered. One after another he passed goblin houses, caves that is, occupied by goblin families, and at length was sure that there were many more than he had passed as he came. He had to use great caution to pass unseen. They lay so close together. Could his string have led him wrong? He still followed, winding it, and still it led him into more thickly populated quarters, until he became quite uneasy and indeed apprehensive, for although he was not afraid of the cobs, the miner's name for the goblins, he was afraid of not finding his way out. But what could he do? It was of no use to sit down and wait for the morning. The morning made no difference here. It was all dark and always dark, and if his string failed him, he was helpless. He might even arrive within a yard of the mine and never know it. Seeing he could do nothing better, he would at least find where the end of the string was, and if possible, how it had come to play him such a trick. He knew by the size of the ball that he was getting pretty near the last of it, when he began to feel a tugging and pulling at it. What could it mean? Turning a sharp corner, he thought he heard strange sounds. These grew, as he went on, to a scuffling and growling and squeaking. And the noise increased until, turning a second sharp corner, he found himself in the midst of it, and the same moment tumbled over a wallowing mass which he knew must be a knot of the cob's creatures. Before he could recover his feet, he had caught some great scratches on his face and several bites on his legs and arms, but as he scrambled to get up, his hand fell upon his pickaxe, and before the horrid beasts could do him any serious harm, he was laying about with it right and left in the dark. The hideous cries which followed gave him the satisfaction of knowing that he had punished some of them pretty smartly for their rudeness, and by their scampering and their retreating howls, he perceived that he had routed them. He stood a little, weighing his battle-axe in his hand, as if it had been the most precious lump of metal. But indeed, no lump of gold itself could have been so precious at that time as that common tool. Then he untied the end of the string from it, put the ball in his pocket, and still stood thinking. It was clear that the cob's creatures had found his axe, and had between them carried it off, and had so led him he knew not where, but for all his thinking he could not tell what he ought to do, until suddenly he became aware of a glimmer of light in the distance. Just remember, he's underground in the tunnels. Without a moment's hesitation he set out for it, as fast as the unknown and rugged way would permit. Yet again, turning a corner, led by the dim light, he spied something quite new in his experience of the underground regions, a small, irregular shape of something shining. Going up to it, he found it a piece of mica, or Muscovy glass, called sheep silver in Scotland, and the light flickering as if from a fire behind it. After trying in vain for some time to discover an entrance to the place where it was burning, he came at length to a small chamber, in which an opening high in the wall revealed a glow beyond. To this opening he managed to scramble up, and then he saw a strange sight. Below sat a little group of goblins around a fire, the smoke of which vanished in the darkness far aloft. The sides of the cave were full of shining minerals like those of the palace hall, and the company was evidently of a superior order, for every one wore stones about head or arms or waist, shining, dull, gorgeous colours in the light of the fire. Nor had Curdie looked long before he recognised the king himself, and found that he had made his way into the inner apartment of the royal family. He had never had such a good chance of hearing something. He crept through the hole as softly as he could, scrambled a good way down the wall toward them without attracting attention, and then sat down and listened. The king, evidently the queen, and probably the crown prince and the prime minister were talking together. He was sure of the queen by her shoes, for as she warmed her feet at the fire, he saw them quite plainly. "That will be fun," said the one he took for a crown prince. It was the first whole sentence he heard. "I don't see why you should think it such a grand affair," said his stepmother, tossing her head backward. "You must remember, my spouse," interposed his majesty, as if making excuse for his son. "He has got the same blood in him. His mother—" "Don't talk to me of his mother. You positively encourage his unnatural fancies. Whatever belongs to that mother ought to be cut out of him." "You forget yourself, my dear," said the king. "I don't," said the queen. "Nor you either. If you expect me to approve of such coarse tastes, you will find yourself mistaken. I won't wear shoes for nothing." "You must acknowledge, however," the king said with a little groan, "that this at least is no whim of Harelip's, but a matter of state policy. You are well aware that his gratification comes purely from the pleasure of sacrificing himself to the public good. Does it not, Harelip?" "Yes, father, of course it does, only it will be nice to make her cry. I'll have the skin taken off between her toes and tie them up till they grow together. Then her feet will be like other people's, and there will be no occasion for her to wear shoes." "Do you mean to insinuate I've got toes, you unnatural wretch?" cried the queen, and she moved angrily toward Harelip. The counsellor, however, who was between them, leaned forward so as to prevent her touching him, but only as if to address the prince. "Your Royal Highness," he said, "possibly requires to be reminded that you have got 3 toes yourself, 1 on one foot, 2 on the other." "Ha, ha, ha!" shouted the queen triumphantly. The counsellor, encouraged by this mark of favour, went on. "It seems to me, Your Royal Highness, it would greatly endear you to your future people, proving to them that you are not the less one of them." one of themselves, that you had the misfortune to be born of a son, mother, if you were to command upon yourself the comparatively slight operation which, in a more extended form, you so wisely meditate with regard to your future princess." "Ha, ha, ha," laughed the Queen louder than before, and the King and the Minister joined in the laugh. It was anything but a laughing matter to Harelip. He growled, and for a few moments the others continued to express their enjoyment of his discomfiture. The Queen was the only one Curdie could see with any distinctness. She sat sideways to him, and the light of the fire shone full upon her face. He could not consider her handsome. Her nose was certainly broader at the end than at its extreme length, and her eyes, instead of being horizontal, were set up like two perpendicular eggs, one on the broad and the other on the small end. Her mouth was no bigger than a small buttonhole until she laughed, when it stretched from ear to ear, only to be sure her ears were very nearly in the middle of her cheeks. Anxious to hear everything they might say, Curdie ventured to slide down a smooth part of the rock just under him to a projection below upon which he thought to rest. But whether he was not careful enough, or the projection gave way, down he came with a rush on the floor of the cavern, bringing with him a great rumbling shower of stones. The goblins jumped from their seats in more anger than consternation, for they had never yet seen anything to be afraid of in the palace. But when they saw Curdie with his pick in his hand, their rage was mingled with fear, for they took him for the first of an invasion of miners. The king, notwithstanding, drew himself up to his full height of 4 feet, spread himself to his full breadth of 3.5, for he was the handsomest and squarest of all the goblins, and strutting up to Curdie, planted himself with outspread feet before him, and said with dignity, "Pray, what right have you in my palace?" "The right of necessity, your majesty," answered Curdie. "I lost my way and did not know where I was wandering to." "How did you get in?" "By a hole in the mountain." "But you are a miner. Look at your pickaxe." Curdie did look at it, answering, "I came upon it, lying on the ground, a little way from here. I tumbled over some wild beasts who were playing with it. Look, your majesty," and Curdie showed him how he was scratched and bitten. The king was pleased to find him behave more politely than he had expected from what his people had told him concerning the miners, for he attributed it to the power of his own presence, but he did not therefore feel friendly to the intruder. "You will oblige me by walking out of my dominions at once," he said, well knowing what a mockery lay in the words. In other words, it's a huge labyrinth that he's going to have to find his way through. "With pleasure, if your majesty will give me a guide," said Curdie. "I will give you 1,000, said the king, with a scoffing air of magnificent liberality. "One will be quite sufficient," said Curdie, but the king uttered a strange shout, half halloo, half roar, and in rushed goblins till the cave was swarming. He said something to the first of them which Curdie could not hear, and it was passed from one to another, till in a moment the farthest in the crowd had evidently heard and understood it. They began to gather about him in a way he did not relish, and he retreated toward the wall. They pressed upon him. "Stand back," said Curdie, grasping his pickaxe tighter by his knee. They only grinned and pressed closer. Curdie bethought himself and began to rhyme. 10, 20, 30, you're all so very dirty. 20, 30, 40, you're all so thick and snorty. 30, 40, 50... you're all so puff and snifty. 40, 50, 60, beast and man so mixty. 50, 60, 70, mixty, maxty, 11, 60, 70, 80, all your cheeks so slaty. 70, 80, 90, all your hands so flinty. Flinty, he must have made it rhyme. 80, 90, 100, altogether dundred. The goblins fell back a little when he began, and made horrible faces all through the rhyme, as if eating something so disagreeable that it set their teeth on edge and gave them the creeps. But whether it was that the rhyming words were most of them no words at all, for a new rhyme had being considered more efficacious, that's effective, Curdie had made it on the spur of the moment, or whether it was that the presence of the king and queen gave them courage, I cannot tell. But the moment the rhyme was over, they crowded on him again, and out shot 100 long arms with a multitude of thick, nailless fingers at the end of them to lay hold upon him. Then Curdie heaved up his axe, but being as gentle as courageous, and not wishing to kill any of them, he turned the end which was square and blunt like a hammer, and with that came down a great blow on the head of the goblin nearest him. Hard as the head of all goblins are, he thought he must feel that, and so he did, no doubt, but he only gave a horrible cry and sprung at Curdie's throat. Curdie, however, drew back in time, and just at that critical moment remembered the vulnerable part of the goblin body. He made a sudden rush at the king and stamped with all his might on his majesty's feet. The king gave a most unkingly howl and almost fell in the fire. Curdie then rushed into the crowd, stamping left and right. The goblins drew back, howling on every side as he approached, but they were so crowded that few of those he attacked could escape his tread, and the shrieking and roaring that filled the cave would have appalled Curdie but for the good hope it gave him. They were tumbling over each other in heaps in their eagerness to rush from the cave, when a new assailant suddenly faced him, the Queen. With flaming eyes and expanded nostrils, her hair standing half up from her head, rushed at him. She trusted in her shoes. They were of granite, hollowed like French sabots, that's clogs. Curdie would have endured much rather than hurt a woman, even if she was a goblin, but here was an affair of life and death. Forgetting her shoes, he made a great stamp on one of her feet, but she instantly returned it with very different effect, causing him frightful pain and almost disabling him. His only chance with her would have been to attack the granite shoes with his pickaxe, but before he could think of that, she had caught him up in her arms and was rushing him across the cave. She dashed him into a hole in the wall with a force that almost stunned him, but although he could not move, he was not too far gone to hear her great cry and the rush of multitudes of soft feet, but followed by the sounds of something heaved up against the rock, after which came a multitudinous patter of stones falling near him. The last had not ceased when he grew very faint, for his head had been badly cut, and at last insensible. When he came to himself, there was perfect silence about him, and utter darkness, but for the merest glimmer in one tiny spot. He crawled to it and found that they had heaved a slab against the mouth of the hole, past the edge of which a poor little gleam found its way from the fire. He could not move it a hair's breadth, for they had piled a great heap of stones against it. He crawled back to where he had been lying, in the faint hope of finding his pickaxe, but after a vain search, he was at last compelled to acknowledge himself in an evil plight. He sat down and tried to think, but soon fell fast asleep. And that's the end of chapter 18. And I'm going to have another drink of water, and I do hope that Forres is having a nice sleep, or is able to be just drowsily listening anyway. And much love to Turkey from New Zealand. It's lovely having you here, being able to enjoy the stories. And for the rest of you, drink your water. Don't forget. Oh, how are we going? Oh, we're probably about halfway through our story time. The next chapter is chapter 19, and it's called Goblin Counsels. And it's not a short one, but it's not a long one either. So we shall carry on. The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, chapter 19, Goblin Counsels. He must have slept a long time, for when he awoke he felt wonderfully restored. Indeed, he felt almost well, and he was also very hungry. There were voices in the outer cave. Once more then it was night, for the goblins slept during the day and went about their affairs during the night. In the universal and constant darkness of their dwelling they had no reason to prefer the one arrangement to the other, but from aversion to the Sun People they chose to be busy when there was least chance of their being met, either by the miners below when they were burrowing, or by the people of the mountain above when they were feeding their sheep or catching their goats. And indeed it was only when the sun was away that the outside of the mountain was sufficiently like their own dismal regions, to be endurable to their mole eyes. So thoroughly had they become disused to any light beyond that of their own fires and torches. Curdie listened and soon found that they were talking of himself. "How long will it take?" said Harelip. "Not many days, I should think," answered the king. "They are poor feeble creatures, those sun people, and want to be always eating. We can go a week at a time without food and be all the better for it. But I've been told they eat 2 or 3 times every day. Can you believe it? They must be quite hollow inside, not at all like us, 9/10 of whose bulk is solid flesh and bone. Yes, I judge a week of starvation will do for him." "If I may be allowed a word," interposed the Queen, "and I think I ought to have some voice in the matter." "The wretch is entirely at your disposal, my spouse," interrupted the King. "He is your property. You caught him yourself. We should never have done it." The Queen laughed. She seemed in far better humour than the night before. "I was about to say," she resumed, "that it does seem a pity to waste so much fresh meat." "What are you thinking about, my love?" said the King. "The very notion of starving him implies that we are not going to give him any meat, either salt or fresh." "I'm not such a stupid as that comes to," returned Her Majesty. "What I mean is that by the time he is starved there will hardly be a picking upon his bones." The King gave a great laugh. "Well, my spouse, you may have him when you like," he said, "but I don't fancy him for my part. I'm pretty sure he is tough eating." "That would be to honour instead of punish his insolence," returned the Queen. "But why should our poor creatures be deprived of so much nourishment? Our little dogs and cats and pigs and small bears would enjoy him very much." "You are the best of housekeepers, my lovely Queen," said her husband. "Let it be so by all means. Let us have our people in and get him out and kill him at once. He deserves it. The mischief he might have brought upon us, now that he has penetrated so far as our most retired citadel, is incalculable. Or rather, let us tie him hand and foot, and have the pleasure of seeing him torn to pieces by full torchlight in the great hall." "Better and better," cried the Queen and Prince together, both of them clapping their hands, and the Prince made an ugly noise with his hare-lip, just as if he had intended to be one at the feast. "But," added the Queen, bethinking herself, "he is so troublesome, for as poor creatures as they are, there is something about those sun people that is very troublesome. I cannot imagine how it is that with such superior strength and skill and understanding as ours, we permit them to exist at all. Why do we not destroy them entirely and use their cattle and grazing lands at our pleasure? Of course, we don't want to live in their horrid country. It's far too glaring for our quieter and more refined tastes, but we might use it for a sort of outhouse, you know. Even our creatures' eyes might get used to it, and if they did grow blind, that would be of no consequence, provided they grow fat as well. But we might even keep their great cows and other creatures, and then we should have a few more luxuries, such as cream and cheese, which at present we only taste occasionally when our brave men have succeeded in carrying some off from their farms." "It is worth thinking of," said the King, "and I don't know why you should be the first to suggest it, except that you have a positive genius for conquest. But still, as you say, there is something very troublesome about them, and it would be better, as I understand you to suggest, that we should starve him for a day or two first, so that he may be a little less frisky when we take him out. Once there was a goblin living in a hole. Busy he was cobblin', a shoe without a sole. By came a birdie. Goblin, what do you do? Cobble at a sturdy upper leather shoe. What's the good of that, sir? Said the little bird. Why, it's very pat, sir, plain without a word. Where 'tis all a hill, sir, never can be holes. Why should their shoes have soles, sir, when they've got no soles? What's that horrible noise? Cried the Queen, shuddering from pot metal head to granite shoes. I declare, said the King, in solemn indignation, it's the sun creature in the hole. "Stop that disgusting noise," cried the Crown Prince valiantly, getting up and standing in front of the heap of stones with his face towards Curdie's prison. "Do now, or I'll break your head." "Break away," shouted Curdie, and began singing again. "Once there was a goblin living in a hole." "I really cannot bear it," said the Queen. "If I could only get at his horrid toes with my slippers again." "I think we'd better go to bed," said the King. "It's not time to go to bed," said the Queen. "I would if I were you," said Curdie. "Impertinent wretch," said the Queen, with the utmost scorn in her voice. "An impossible if," said His Majesty with dignity. "Quite," returned Curdie, and began singing again. "Go to bed, goblin do, help the Queen take off her shoe. If you do, it will disclose a horrid set of sprouting toes." "What a lie!" roared the Queen in a rage. "By the way, that reminds me," said the King, "that for as long as we have been married I have never seen your feet, Queen. I think you might take off your shoes when you go to bed. They positively hurt me sometimes." "I will do just as I like," retorted the Queen sulkily. "You ought to do as your hubby wishes you," said the King. "I will not," said the Queen. "Then I insist upon it," said the King. Apparently His Majesty approached the Queen for the purpose of following the advice given by Curdie, for the latter heard a scuffle and then a great roar from the King. "Will you be quiet then?" said the Queen wickedly. "Yes, yes, Queen, I only meant to coax you." "Hands off!" cried the Queen triumphantly. "I'm going to bed. You may come when you like, but as long as I am Queen, I will sleep in my shoes. It is my royal privilege. Harelip, go to bed." "I'm going," said Harelip sleepily. "So am I," said the King. "Come along then," said the Queen, "and mind you're good, or I'll—" "Oh, no, no, no," screamed the King in the most supplicating tones. Curdie heard only a muttered reply in the distance, and then the cave was quite still. They had left the fire burning, and the light came through brighter than before. Curdie thought it was time to try again if anything could be done, but he found he could not get even a finger through the chink between the slab and the rock. He gave a great rush with his shoulder against the slab, but it yielded no more than if it had been part of the rock. All he could do was to sit down and think again. By and by he came up to the resolution to pretend to be dying, in the hope they might take him out before his strength was too much exhausted to let him have a chance. Then for the creatures, if he could but find his axe again, he would have no fear of them, and if it were not for the Queen's horrid shoes, he would have no fear at all. Meantime, until they should come again at night, there was nothing for him to do but forge new rhymes, now his only weapons. He had no intention of using them at present, of course, but it was well to have a stock, for he might live to want them, and the manufacture of them would help to while away the time. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm having a drink of water before the next one. Great to have you here, Naomi. I'm so glad you were able to come here and have a listen to the stories. I remember lying on my bed and my mum reading me stories when I was not well. It was the one thing that was good about being ill, was being able to listen to the stories. It helped to take my mind off how I was feeling. I do hope that we help you with that. And I do hope that resting is actually helping you to get better. Sometimes that's what we need, is just to have a good rest and not do all of the other things that we normally do. What do you think? So, have any of you who are listening actually heard this story before? Have you read it yourselves? Like I was saying at the beginning, it's a Victorian fantasy story, and it's one. I grew up in a family where my grandmother would find a book on her shelves that she had remembered reading to her children, my mum and my aunts and uncles. And she would find it and she would decide that it was a book that I needed, and so she would give it to me, or she would give it to my mum, and my mum would have another read of it for herself, or she would read it out loud to me and then give it to me. So I have memories of reading a lot of books that most people my age, even though I'm quite old now, most people my age have never even heard of, just because I have a family that loved books, and because they'd had some wonderful stories and lots of wonderful memories of these stories, they had kept ones that most other people don't keep. So I'm really looking forward to finding my boxes of books and digging them out and being able to read more stories to you. So we shall carry on, and as I've said before in the previous break, there are links in the chat, but also they're down below in my profile to YouTube as well as Discord. If you want to join us over on the Discord, you're welcome to. You can discuss stories, make suggestions for other really old-fashioned stories, preferably ones that are in the public domain that I can read when I have finished whatever I'm currently reading. But also over on YouTube, you can listen to some of my previous stories that I've been reading. So there's Millie Molly Mandy, there's The Wind in the Willows, there's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. There is The Secret Garden, from the book, not from the play, or not from the TV series or the movie or anything like that. And there's also A Little Princess, which is the one that we've just finished before starting this book. There's probably now 2 parts of that one up. There's a few more still to come. They're all scheduled to release the same days that I do my reading, but a week or 2 after I've actually read them over here, because Twitch doesn't keep them more than 2 weeks. So I shall carry on, and we are going to read Chapter 20 of The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. Irene's Clue. That same morning, early, the princess woke in a terrible fright. There was a hideous noise in her room of creatures snarling and hissing and racketing about as if they were fighting. The moment she came to herself, she remembered something she had never thought of again. What her mother told her to do when she was frightened. She immediately took off her ring and put it under her pillow. As she did so, she fancied she felt a finger and thumb take it gently from under her palm. It must be my grandmother, she said to herself, and the thought gave her such courage that she stopped to put on her dainty little slippers before running from the room. While doing this, she caught sight of a long cloak of sky blue thrown over the back of a chair by her bedside. She had never seen it before, but it was evidently waiting for her. She put it on, and then, feeling with the forefinger of her right hand, soon found her grandmother's thread, which she proceeded at once to follow, expecting it would lead her straight up the old stair. When she reached the door, she found it went down and ran along the floor so that she had almost to crawl in order to keep a hold of it. Now, just explaining for those who weren't here previously, she had met her great-great-grandmother up in a tower in the castle. Nobody else seems to know she's there. And one of the things her grandmother has done is she has given her a ring which has attached to it a very, very, very special thread, which the grandmother has one end of it and the princess has the other, and it's attached to the ring that she wears, which sounds a bit odd, but that's the way it works. It's a fantasy story, just trust it. And if she's ever in trouble, she's to take the ring off her finger and put it under her pillow and then follow the thread to her grandmother or to the help that she needs. So we're going to carry on now. She expected it to lead straight up the old stair, because that's where her grandmother is. Then, to her surprise and somewhat to her dismay, she found that instead of leading her toward the stair, it turned in quite the opposite direction. It led her through certain narrow passages toward the kitchen, turning aside ere she reached it, and guiding her to a door which communicated with a small back yard. Some of the maids were already up, and this door was standing open. Across the yard the thread still ran along the ground, until it brought her to a door in the wall, which opened upon the mountainside. When she had passed through, the thread rose to about half her height, and she could hold it with ease as she walked. It led her straight up the mountain. The cause of her alarm was less frightful than she supposed. The cook's great black cat, pursued by the housekeeper's terrier, had bounced against her bedroom door, which had not been properly fastened, and the two had burst into her room together and commenced a battle royale. How the nurse came to sleep through it was a mystery, but I suspect the old lady had something to do with it. The old lady being the grandmother. It was a clear, warm morning. The wind blew deliciously over the mountainside. Here and there she saw a late primrose, but she did not stop to call on them. The sky was mottled with small clouds. The sun was not yet up, but some of their fluffy edges had caught his light, the sun's light, and hung out orange and gold-coloured fringes upon the air. The dew lay in round drops upon the leaves and hung like tiny diamonds from the blades of grass about her path. "How lovely that bit of gossamer is," thought the princess, looking at a long undulating line that shone at some distance from her up the hill. It was not the time for gossamers, though, and Irene soon discovered that it was her own thread she saw shining on before her in the light of the morning. It was leading her she knew not whither, but she had never in her life been out before sunrise, and everything was so fresh and cool and lively and full of something coming that she felt too happy to be afraid of anything. After leading her up a good distance, the thread turned to the left and down the path upon which she and Lootie had met Curdie. But she never thought of that, for now in the morning light, with its far outlook over the country, no path could have been more open and airy and cheerful, because they're on the side of a mountain. She could see the road almost to the horizon, along which she had so often watched her king papa and his troop come shining, with the bugle blast cleaving the air before them, and it was like a companion to her. Down and down the path went, and then up, and then down, and then up again, getting rugged and more rugged as it went. Still along the path went the silvery thread, and still along the thread went Irene's little rosy-tipped forefinger. By and by she came to a little stream that jabbered and prattled down the hill, and up the side of the stream went both path and thread. And still the path grew rougher and steeper, and the mountain grew wilder, till Irene began to think she was going a very long way from home. And when she turned to look back, she saw that the level country had vanished, and the rough, bare mountain had closed in about her, but still on went the thread, and on went the princess. Everything around her was getting brighter and brighter as the sun came nearer, till at length the first rays all at once alighted on the top of a rock before her, like some golden creature fresh from the sky. Then she saw that the little stream ran out of a hole in that rock, that the path did not go past the rock, and that the thread was leading her straight up to it. A shudder ran through her from head to foot when she found that the thread was actually taking her into the hole out of which the stream ran. It ran out babbling joyously, but she had to go in. She did not hesitate. Right into the hole she went, which was high enough to let her walk without stooping. For a little way there was a brown glimmer, but at the first turn it all but ceased, and before she had gone many paces she was in total darkness. Then she began to be frightened indeed. Every moment she kept feeling the thread backward, and as she went further and further into the darkness of the great hollow mountain, she kept thinking more and more about her grandmother, and all that she had said to her, and how kind she had been, and how beautiful she was, and all about her lovely room, and the fire of roses, and the great lamp that sent its light through stone walls. And she became more and more sure that the thread could not have gone there of itself, and that her grandmother must have sent it. But it tried her dreadfully when the path went down very steep, and especially when she came to places where she had to go down rough stairs, and even sometimes a ladder. Through one narrow passage after another, over lumps of rock and sand and clay, the thread guided her until she came to a small hole through which she had to creep. Finding no change on the other side, "Shall I ever go back?" she thought over and over again, wondering at herself that she was not 10 times more frightened, and other feelings as if she were only walking in the story of a dream. Sometimes she heard the noise of water, a dull gurgling inside the rock. By and by she heard the sounds of blows, which came nearer and nearer, but again they grew duller and almost died away. In 100 directions she turned, obedient to the guiding thread. At last she spied a dull red shine, and came up to the mica window, and thence away and round about, and right into a cavern where glowed the red embers of a fire. Here the thread began to rise. It rose as high as her head and higher still. What should she do if she lost her hold? She was pulling it down. She might break it. She could see it far up, glowing as red as her fire opal in the light of the embers. But presently she came to a huge heap of stones, piled in a slope against the wall of the cavern. On these she climbed, and soon recovered the level of the thread, only, however, to find, the next moment, that it vanished through the heap of stones and left her standing on it with her face to the solid rock. For one terrible moment she felt as if her grandmother had forsaken her. The thread which the spiders had spun far over the seas, which her grandmother had sat in the moonlight and spun again for her, which she had tempered in the rose fire and tied to her opal ring, had left her, had gone where she could no longer follow it, had brought her into a horrible cavern and left her. She was forsaken indeed. "When shall I wake?" she said to herself in an agony, but at the same moment knew that it was no dream. She threw herself upon the heap and began to cry. It was well she did not know what creatures, one of them with stone shoes on her feet, were lying in the next cave, but neither did she know who was on the other side of the slab. At length a thought struck her, that at least she could follow the thread backward and thus get out of the mountain and home. She rose at once and found the thread, but the instant she tried to feel it backward, it vanished from her touch. Forward it led her hand up to the heap of stones. Backward it seemed nowhere. Neither could she see it as before in the light of the fire. She burst into a wailing cry and threw herself down on the stones. And that's the end of that chapter. Oh my goodness! She sounds like she's got a rather tricksy grandmother. That's my drink between chapters. I hope you remembered to bring your one with you. Maybe a snack even. That might be a good idea. I'm going to read one more chapter. This one's a bit longer. It's after 4 o'clock here in New Zealand now. It's a bit longer, so I'm going to read it, and then I think we'll finish there for today. It's not the end of the story by any means. We've got plenty of adventure to go. The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, Chapter 21, The Escape. Ooh, what's going to happen? As the princess lay and sobbed, she kept feeling the thread mechanically, following it with her finger many times up to the stones in which it disappeared. By and by she began, still mechanically, to poke her finger in after it, between the stones, as far as she could. All at once it came into her head that she might remove some of the stones and see where the thread went next. Almost laughing at herself for never having thought of this before, she jumped to her feet. Remember, she's only 7 years old, so she's doing pretty good. Her fear vanished. Once more she was certain her grandmother's thread could not have brought her here, just to leave her there. And she began to throw away the stones from the top as fast as she could, sometimes 2 or 3 at a handful, sometimes taking both hands to lift one. After clearing them away a little, she found that the thread turned and went straight downward. Hence, as the heap sloped a good deal, growing of course wider towards its base, she had to throw away a multitude of stones to follow the thread. But this was not all, for she soon found that the thread, after going straight down for a little way, turned first sideways in one direction, then sideways in another, and then shot at various angles hither and thither inside the heap, so that she began to be afraid to clear the thread she must remove the whole huge gathering. She was dismayed at the very idea, but losing no time, set to work with a will. And with aching back and bleeding fingers and hands, she worked on, sustained by the pleasure of seeing the heap slowly diminish and begin to show itself on the opposite side of the fire. Another thing which helped to keep up her courage was that, as often as she uncovered a turn of the thread, instead of lying loose upon the stones, it tightened up. This made her sure that her grandmother was at the end of it somewhere. She had got about halfway down when she started, and nearly fell with fright. Close to her ear, as it seemed, a voice broke out singing, "Jabber, bother, smash, you'll have it all in a crash. Jabber, smash, bother, you'll have the worst of the pother. Smash, bother, jabber." Here Curdie stopped, either because he could not find a rhyme for jabber, or because he remembered what he had forgotten when he woke up at the sound of Irene's labours, that his plan was to make the goblins think he was getting weak. But he had uttered enough to let Irene know who he was. "It's Curdie!" she cried joyfully. "Hush, hush!" came Curdie's voice again from somewhere. "Speak softly." "Why are you singing loud?" said Irene. "Yes, but they know..." "Why, you were singing loud," said Irene. "Yes, but they know I'm here, and they don't know who you are. That you are. Who are you?" "I'm Irene," answered the princess. "I know who you are quite well. You're Curdie." "Why, however did you come here, Irene?" "My great-great-grandmother sent me, and I think I've found out why. You can't get out, I suppose." "No, I can't," he said. "What are you doing?" "Clearing away a huge heap of stones." "There's a princess!" exclaimed Curdie in a tone of delight, but still speaking in little more than a whisper. "I can't think how you got here, though. My grandmother sent me after her thread." "I don't know what you mean," said Curdie, "but you're there, it doesn't much matter." "Oh, yes, it does," returned Irene. "I should never have been here but for her. You can tell me all about it when we get out then. There's no time to lose now," said Curdie, and Irene went to work as fresh as when she began. "There's such a lot of stones," she said. "It will take me a long time to get them all away." "How far have you got?" asked Curdie. "I've got about the halfway, but the other half is ever so much bigger." "I don't think you will have to move the lower half. Do you see a slab laid up against the wall?" Irene looked and felt about with her hands and soon perceived the outlines of the slab. "Yes," she answered, "I do." "Then I think," rejoined Curdie, "when you have cleared the slab about halfway down, or a little more, I shall be able to push it over." "I must follow my thread," returned Irene, "whatever I do." "What do you mean?" "You will see when you get out here," answered the princess, and then she went on harder than ever. But she was soon satisfied that what Curdie wanted done and what the thread wanted done were one and the same thing. For she not only saw that by following the turns of the thread she had been clearing the face of the slab, but that, a little more than halfway down, the thread went through the chink between the slab and the wall into the place where Curdie was confined, so that she could not follow it any further until the slab was out of the way. As soon as she found this, she said in a right joyous whisper, "Now, Curdie, I think if you were to give a great push, the slab would tumble over." "Stand quite clear then," said Curdie, "and let me know when you are ready." Irene got off the heap and stood on one side of it. "Now, Curdie," she cried. Curdie gave a great rush with his shoulder against it. Out tumbled the slab on the heap, and out crept Curdie over the top of it. "You have saved my life, Irene," he whispered. "Oh, Curdie, I'm so glad. Let's get out of this horrid place as fast as we can." "That's easier said than done," returned he. "Oh, no, it's quite easy," said Irene. "We have only to follow my thread. I'm sure that it's going to take us out now." She had already begun to follow it over the fallen slab into the hole, while Curdie was searching the floor of the cavern for his pickaxe. "Here it is," he cried. "No, it's not," he added in a disappointed tone. "What can it be, then? I declare, it's a torch." "That is jolly. It's better almost than my pickaxe." "Much better if it weren't for those stone shoes," he went on as he lighted the torch by blowing the last embers of the expiring fire. When he looked up with the lighted torch casting a glare into the great darkness of the huge cavern, he caught sight of Irene, disappearing in the hole out of which he had himself just come. "Where are you going there?" he cried. "That's not the way out. That's where I couldn't get out." "I know that," said Irene. "But this is the way my thread goes, and I must follow it." "What nonsense the child talks," said Curdie to himself. "I must follow her, though, and see that she comes to no harm. She will soon find she can't get out that way, and then she will come with me." So he crept once more over the slab into the hole with his torch in his hand, but when he looked about it, he could see her nowhere. and now he discovered that although the hole was narrow, it was much larger than he had supposed, for in one direction the roof came down very low, and the hole went off in a narrow passage, of which he could not see the end. The princess must have crept in there. He got on his knees and one hand, holding the torch with the other, and crept after her. The hole twisted about, in some parts so low that he could hardly get through, in others so high that he could not see the roof, but everywhere it was narrow, far too narrow for a goblin to get through, and so I presume they never thought that Curdie might. He was beginning to feel very uncomfortable lest he could not see the end. The princess, when he heard her voice almost close to his ear, whispering, "Aren't you coming, Curdie?" And then, when he turned the next corner, there she stood, waiting for him. "I knew you couldn't go wrong in that narrow hole, but now you must keep by me, for here is a great wide place," she said. "I can't understand it," said Curdie, half to himself, half to Irene. "Never mind," she returned. "Wait till we get out." Curdie, utterly astonished that she had already got so far, and by a path he had known nothing of, thought it better to let her do as she pleased. "At all events," he said again to himself, "I know nothing about the way, minor as I am, and she seems to think she does know something about it, though how she should passes my comprehension, so she's just as likely to find her way as I am. And as she insists on taking the lead, I must follow. We can't be much worse off than we are anyhow." Sorry, my nose is itchy. Reasoning thus, he followed her a few steps, and came out in another great cavern, across which Irene walked in a straight line, as confidently as if she knew every step of the way. Curdie went on after her, flashing his torch about, and trying to see something of what lay around them. Suddenly he started back a pace, as the light fell upon something close by Irene, which Irene was passing. It was a platform of rock, raised a few feet from the floor, and covered with sheepskins, upon which lay two horrible figures asleep, at once recognised by Curdie as the king and queen of the goblins. He lowered his torch instantly, lest the light should awake them. As he did so, it flashed upon his pickaxe lying by the side of the queen, whose hand lay close by the handle of it. "Stop one moment," he whispered. "Hold my torch, and don't let the light on their faces." Irene shuddered when she saw the frightful creatures whom she had passed without observing them, but she did as he requested, and turning her back, held the torch low in front of her. Curdie drew his pickaxe carefully away, and as he did so, spied one of her feet projecting from under the skins. The great clumsy granite shoe, exposed thus to his hand, was a temptation not to be resisted. He laid hold of it, and with cautious efforts drew it off. The moment he succeeded, he saw to his astonishment that what he had sung in ignorance to annoy the queen was actually true. She had 6 horrible toes. Overjoyed at his success, and seeing by the huge bump in the sheepskins where the other foot was, he proceeded to lift them gently, for if he could only succeed in carrying away the other shoe as well, he would be no more afraid of the goblins than of so many flies. But as he pulled at the second shoe, the queen gave a growl and sat up in bed. The same instant the king awoke also, and sat up beside her. "Run, Irene!" cried Curdie, for though he was not now in the least afraid for himself, he was for the princess. Irene looked once round and saw the fearful creatures awake, and like the wise princess she was, dashed the torch on the ground and extinguished it, crying out, "Here, Curdie, take my hand!" He darted to her side, forgetting neither the queen's shoe nor his pickaxe, and caught hold of her hand as she sped fearlessly where her thread guided her. They heard the queen gave a great bellow, but they had a good start, for it would be some time before they could get torches lighted to pursue them. Just as they thought they saw a gleam behind them, the thread brought them to a very narrow opening, through which Irene crept easily, and Curdie with difficulty. "Now," said Curdie, "I think we shall be safe." "Of course we shall," returned Irene. Sorry, I'm just unlocking my phone. Oops, and I turned a page. "Why do you think so?" asked Curdie. "Because my grandmother is taking care of us." "That's all nonsense," said Curdie. "I don't know what you mean." "Then if you don't know what I mean, what right have you to call it nonsense?" asked the princess, a little offended. "I beg your pardon, Irene," said Curdie. "I did not mean to vex you." "Of course not," returned the princess. "But why do you think we shall be safe?" "Because the king and queen are far too stout to get through that hole." "There may be ways round," she said. "To be sure there might. We are not out of it yet," acknowledged Curdie. "But what do you mean by the king and the queen?" asked the princess. "I should never call such creatures as those a king and queen." "Their own people do, though," answered Curdie. The princess asked more questions, and Curdie, as they walked leisurely along, gave her a full account, not only of the character and habits of the goblins, so far as he knew them, but of his own adventures with them, beginning from the very night after that in which he had met her and Lootie upon the mountain. When he had finished, he begged Irene to tell him how it was that she had come to his rescue. So Irene, too, had to tell a long story, which she did in rather a roundabout manner, interrupted by many questions concerning things she had not explained. But her tale, as he did not believe more than half of it, left everything as unaccountable to him as before, and he was nearly as much perplexed as to what he must think of the princess. He could not believe that she was deliberately telling stories, and the only conclusion he could come to was that Lootie had been playing the child tricks, inventing no end of lies to frighten her for her own purposes. "But how ever did Lootie come to let you go into the mountain alone?" he asked. "Lootie knows nothing about it. I left her fast asleep, at least I think so. I hope my grandmother won't let her get into trouble, for it wasn't her fault at all, as my grandmother very well knows." "But how did you find your way to me?" persisted Curdie. "I told you already," answered Irene, "by keeping my finger upon my grandmother's thread, as I am doing now." "You don't mean you've got the thread there?" "Of course I do. I have told you so 10 times already. I have hardly, except when I was removing the stones, taken my finger off it. There," she added, guiding Curdie's hand to the thread. "You feel it yourself, don't you?" "I feel nothing at all," replied Curdie. "Then what can be the matter with your finger? I feel it perfectly. To be sure, it's very thin, and in the sunlight looks just like the thread of a spider, though there are many of them twisted together to make it. But for all that, I can't think why you shouldn't feel it as well as I do." Curdie was too polite to say he did not believe there was any thread at all. What he did say was, "Well, I can make nothing of it." "I can, though, and you must be glad of that, for it will do for both of us," she said. "We're not out yet," he said. "We soon shall be," returned Irene confidently, and now the thread went downward and led Irene's hand to a hole in the floor of the cavern, whence came a sound of running water which they had been hearing for some time now. "It goes into the ground now, Curdie," she said, stopping. He had been listening to another sound which his practised ear had caught long ago, and which had also been growing louder. It was the noise the goblin miners make at their work, and they seemed to be at no great distance now. Irene heard it the moment she stopped. "What is that noise?" she asked. "Do you know, Curdie?" "Yes, it's the goblins digging and burrowing," he answered. "And don't you know for what purpose they do it?" "No, I haven't the least idea. Would you like to see them?" he asked, wishing to have another try after their secret. "If my thread took me there, I shouldn't much mind, but I don't want to see them, and I can't leave my thread. It leads me down into the hole, and we had better go at once." "Very well. Shall I go in first?" said Curdie. "No, better not. You can't feel the thread," she answered, stepping down through a narrow break in the floor of the cavern. "Oh!" she cried, "I'm in the water. It is running strong, but it is not deep, and there's just room to walk. Make haste, Curdie." He tried, but the hole was too small for him to get in. "Go on a bit," he said, shouldering his pickaxe. In a few moments he had cleared a large opening, and followed her. They went on down and down with the running water, Curdie getting more and more afraid it was leading them to some terrible gulf in the heart of the mountain. In one or two places he had to break away the rock to make room before even Irene could get through, at least without hurting herself. But at length they spied a glimmer of light, and in a minute more they were almost blinded by the first full sunlight into which they emerged. It was some little time before the princess could see well enough to discover that they stood in her own garden, close by the seat on which she and her king papa had sat that afternoon. They had come out by the channel of the little stream. She danced and clapped her hands with delight. "Now, Curdie," she cried, "won't you believe what I told you about my grandmother and her thread?" For she had felt all the time that Curdie was not believing what she had told him. "There, don't you see it shining on before us?" "I don't see anything," persisted Curdie. "Then you must believe without seeing," said the princess, "for you can't deny it has brought me out of the mountain." "I can't deny we are out of the mountain, and I should be very ungrateful indeed to deny that you had brought me out of it." "I couldn't have done it but for the thread," persisted Irene. "That's the part I don't understand," said Curdie. "Well, come along, and Lootie will get you something to eat. I'm sure you must want it very much." "Indeed I do, but my father and mother will be so anxious about me. I must make haste. First up the mountain to tell my mother, and then down into the mine again to acquaint my father." "Very well, Curdie, but you can't get out without coming this way, and I will take you through the house, for that is nearest." They met no one by the way, for indeed, as before, the people were here and there, and everywhere searching for the princess. When they got in, Irene found that the thread, as she had half expected, went up the old staircase, and a new thought struck her. She turned to Curdie and said, "My grandmother wants me. Do come up with me and see her. Then you will know that I have been telling the truth. Do come, to please me, Curdie. I can't bear you should think I say what is not true." "I have never doubted you believed what you said," returned Curdie. "I only thought you had some fancy in your head that was not correct." "But do come, dear Curdie." The little miner could not withstand this appeal, and though he felt shy in what seemed to him such a huge, grand house, he yielded and followed her up the stair. And that's the end of the chapter. And since it's after 4:20, I'm not reading any more today. But I do want to thank you all for being here and listening. That's wonderful. Please come and join us in our Discord, on our Discord server. Hang on, Discord. Whoop. Yes, that one. And then you can talk about the story. You can say if you've heard the story before, you can tell about when you first heard it, what your first experiences of the story. And if you haven't heard it before, you can draw some pictures. Did you get any pictures in your mind when you were listening to the story? I used to have that all the time when I was listening to stories, where I would have the picture that the author was writing would be in my mind so clear, and then somebody would stop reading and it was like, oh, I'm back in the normal world. What happened? So if you get pictures like that, draw them. It doesn't matter if you're good at drawing them or not. It doesn't matter. But come over, introduce yourself, say hi. Also, if you join our Discord server, it should tell you when I go live over here on Twitch. I'm not sure if it worked this time, but it's meant to work. So we'll see if it happens. And also, for those of you who want to know, here is our link on YouTube. There it is. I'm just checking that it's come up on the screen next to me. Our link on YouTube is for the stories I've read in the past and where these ones are going to appear in the next week or two, so that you can, if you ever want to listen to them again, you can listen to the whole story right through in as many steps as you want. You'll also get me chattering in between. So there you go. Please come and join us. Please join our community. Just be part of a bunch of people who seem to really enjoy old-fashioned stories that most others have never heard of before. Or they have, but they're vaguely in their memories from a long, long, long time ago. Or maybe we've heard of them like The Little Princess and The Secret Garden stories. We've seen them on TV or as a movie on TV that we remember from when we were growing up, rather than actually hearing the words read from a book. So anyway, come and join us over there at either of those places, and we shall see you next time. I will be reading again in 3 days' time, because it's the weekend now, I read on Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 3 p.m. in New Zealand time. And whatever time that is for you now, just look at the clock and see if you can figure it out. It was just over an hour ago. Whatever day of the week it is for you and whatever part of the world you're in. So there you go. We'll see you next time. Bye.